project has a really intensive review process before we will agree to investigate a case, much less enter our appearances as someone's attorney. So it starts with an inmate writing us a letter. That's sort of what we call stage one. We will not look at a case based on a referral from a family member or anything like that. We need to hear that the person actually wants our help. And then we begin essentially a 4-stage review process. We need to make sure that the inmate is meeting some really basic criteria, for example, that they're actually claiming that they're innocent, not that they have some other legal problem that they want us to help with. If that's the case, we move forward to what we call stage 2, which is a fairly big picture, almost intake screening, where we have some limited information from the inmate and court documents about the case, and we ask a volunteer to review those and give us a recommendation as to whether they think the innocence claim is plausible or not. If we all agree that it may be, we then move it to stage 3, which is our most probably time-intensive phase of review. And at that point, we get our hands on every single piece of information that we can find about a case that's been documented over time. And some of our cases are 40 years or older, so that in itself is quite an endeavor. And the person assigned to it looks at every single piece of paper under the supervision of project staff and makes a recommendation about whether the innocence claim is credible and we should move forward with it. We don't do any field investigation in terms of interviewing witnesses at that point because we don't want to uncover new evidence that would make an inmate have to get into court quickly where we haven't yet decided whether it's an appropriate case for us to take on. If at the end of that sort of very intensive paper review process we think it is a good case, we will present the case to a panel of attorneys with criminal experience on both the defense and prosecution side to get a more neutral take on the strengths and weaknesses of the case, whether it's a good use of the project's resources, and if we do go forward, to get some advice about what that investigation or litigation strategy should look like. If that panel agrees with us that it's a case that's worth moving on with, then we will actively involve our investigator, Nick, to interview witnesses. We'll try to retain experts if necessary, do whatever it is we need to do to try to determine whether we think that the person is in fact innocent, and if so, position the case so that we can litigate it in court. So it's only once we do all of those things that we're ready to even consider going to court with a case. Our project takes all types of cases, so when some people think of the Innocence Project, I think they think of DNA cases because that's really sort of what started off a lot of innocence work, and some of the high-profile cases have been exonerations achieved through DNA testing. So we certainly do look at cases where DNA testing is a possibility, but we're not limited to that. We also look at cases that are purely based on a fact investigation, so essentially reinvestigating a case like it's a cold case to try to find out what actually happened in terms of whether the witnesses were lying at trial or not and things like that. And then we also look at cases that involve other types of science other than DNA. So cases where the conviction was based in significant part on some kind of forensic science testimony, and we'll look back at those to see whether under more modern standards that have developed since the person's trial, that testimony could still be considered reliable or not. So some examples of that are arson cases, where we know that fire science and fire investigations have really changed a lot in the past couple decades, such that older convictions might not be based on solid testimony. Some ballistics cases, cases where shaken baby syndrome has been diagnosed. That's a diagnosis that's being questioned. So we'll look at those kinds of potentially questionable areas of science as well.